Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning into Mojo Story, and I am Muskan Nagpal. Today, we are going to discuss how Shakespeare would react to the term love jihad, and in particular to a law on love jihad. Now, some of you might be thinking, why exactly are we discussing a Firangi Shakespeare in Indian context? But in fact, some would tell you that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. Uh, Now, even if we keep his Indian roots aside, Shakespeare gave us what many have called the greatest love story of our times, Romeo and Juliet. In fact, we have an anti Romeo squad in our country. So, if Romeo and Juliet was stopped by the institution of family, what we're now seeing is controlled by the state. 5 states in India are currently planning a law on love jihad. These states are Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Karnataka, and Assam. Uttar Pradesh already has an ordinance on the same. Recently, a marriage in Lucknow was interrupted by UP police because it went against this very ordinance. So, how would Shakespeare react to this instance? To answer that question, we have with us Jonathan Gill Harris, who's a professor at Ashoka University. Gill teaches Shakespeare, and he believes that Shakespeare would have been a Bollywood director if he were alive today. Most of Gill's classes are in fact like performances. And to give you an idea of this, I would like to show you how Gill takes his classes. He's mostly dancing, and he tries to teach us he tries to teach us Shakespeare by engaging with us through performance. And these are images that I found him after stalking him long enough on Instagram, which, by the way, is a very interesting place to stalk him because he keeps on talking about multiplicity of identities on his profile. He's also authored 2 books called Masala Shakespeare and The First Firangis. He's from New Zealand and now lives in India. In my opinion, he's a living example of what is masala and what is mixture. Thank you, Gil, for joining us.
My pleasure to be here, Muskan.
So I'd like to let you make a few opening comments about how you think Shakespeare is relevant to the Indian context.
That's a question that can be answered in so many ways. I'll tell you how I think Shakespeare is irrelevant. Shakespeare taught in the way that he conventionally is, as a kind of secular version of the Bible, the British secular version of the Bible, as great art with a capital G and a capital A, in response to whom our only appropriate way of engaging should be docile reverence. I think that's what makes Shakespeare relevant. Shakespeare was an entertainer, and he was a commercial entertainer, supremely aware that his audience was mixed, that it consisted of rich and poor, that it consisted of men and women, that it consisted of literate and illiterate people, that it also consisted of Protestants and Catholics. And his plays had to somehow reach all these constituencies. He was also dealing with a multilingual audience. We may think of Shakespeare as the greatest writer in the English language, but the English language had not yet been formalized at the time he was writing, because there was no sense of there being a single language that all English people spoke. There was a variety of dialects spoken across the range of the British Isles. And in London, where his plays were performed, his audiences spoke all these dialects. The theatre in which his plays were produced had to deal with an audience every bit as mixed as the audience that we used to find in single-screen cinema halls for masala movies. So people from the south would speak a somewhat Germanic language. People from the north would speak a Scandinavian dialect. Those from the middle classes, the upper middle classes, there was a bit more French in their dialect. There was a little bit of Latin floating around as well. And of course, in London, there were many immigrant workers from places like Holland and Italy. So Shakespeare had to deal with this extraordinary diversity of backgrounds, and his plays accommodate them in much the same way that a so-called Hindi movie made in the 70s, a Manmohan Desai film, for instance, was never really completely in Hindi. It was in Hindi and Urdu with some English, maybe a splash of Punjabi and Marathi. But the point is that masala movies from the 70s and 80s were made for a mass audience. And that's one of the reasons why I insist, even though Shakespeare's plays are extraordinary and we can learn a lot from them, if Shakespeare was alive today, he would have been writing not for the theatre, but for the cinema, and not for Hollywood, but for Bollywood.
All right. So, on that note, could you tell us that what would Shakespeare think of the term love jihad? And would he see it as a threat to mixtures, as you've already spoken about masalas and how he had linguistic plurality even when he was writing his own plays? So, do you see the term love jihad as a threat to mixture?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. And I would say not the phenomenon of love jihad, but the discourse, the language, the attitude behind the fantasy of love jihad that the state has created. I mean, the cheeky answer would be that Shakespeare wouldn't have known what love jihad is because he had no clue what jihad was. But a more complex answer would recognize that the meaning of jihad, which is, of course, struggle, is something that Shakespeare identifies very much with love. Love for Shakespeare is not something sweet and vanilla and anodyne. It involves pain as well as pleasure. It involves a transgression of boundaries, inevitably. There's a way in which love for Shakespeare is always about deviating from the socially conventional scripts of the time. And so his lovers often find themselves struggling with society, with the assumptions of their parents, with themselves. But I think it's also no coincidence that if you look at Shakespeare's plays closely, what's the most common word in the titles of his plays? It's not king or Henry, it's and. And it's the and that joins lovers who always come from different communities, different worlds, even different species. Romeo and Juliet come from warring clans, the Montagues and the Capulets. Antony and Cleopatra come from Rome and Egypt. Troilus and Cressida are both Trojans, but Cressida goes to the Greek side. So they're basically in enemy camps. You have also Pyramus and Thisbe in the play of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Pyramus and Thisbe, who are kind of prototypes to Romeo and Juliet, again are from warring clans. There's something about this kind of scenario, about love that crosses a boundary and, more importantly, crosses a prohibition of some kind. That seemed irresistible to Shakespeare's imagination, but also irresistible to his audiences.
It's interesting that you mentioned something about prohibition, because I want to talk about how a law against the lawlessness of love or desire can be enacted in itself. And since desire and love are lawless emotions, how is it that a law against the lawlessness of desire can be enacted? And do you think that prohibition, in fact, makes the prospect more tempting?
Well, I think that there is a way in which prohibition and desire tend to walk hand in hand. We often think of prohibition as that which screws a lid on desire. It's arguable that prohibition often generates more than it erases desire. But how can such a law be enacted? Well, we see laws like this enacted over and over again. Desire is something that scares people. It scares, in particular, the guardians of tradition, because love is almost by definition something that refuses to abide by the scripts of tradition. We try to convince ourselves otherwise.
If against love can be enacted. Let me just unmute you, Gil. So I'm sorry we lost you there for a while. Could you repeat yourself?
At what point did you lose me?
I lost you when I asked you the question. So I completely didn't listen, and neither did our audience, I'm assuming.
Okay. So I think that it's no coincidence that I don't think it's a mystery that all sorts of laws are enacted to try and control love, because love, almost by definition, is lawless. It is something that doesn't abide by the scripts that we have created for good or true love or respectable love. We try and convince ourselves that love is something absolutely sweet and pure, that it smells of roses, but we forget the thorns behind the roses. And we forget the extent to which love is something that no matter how much we try to control it socially, it often slips the noose of our attempts to do so, which unfortunately results in states redoubling on their efforts to control love. And that's why we get stories like what we're hearing in Uttar Pradesh and other parts of the country, that love should not be something that exists between two people. Love is rather an arrangement between two families or two larger extended apparatuses that in effect bring together a representative from each in holy matrimony. The idea that men or women, and in particular women, should have absolute agency of their own in love is something that has always troubled societies around the world. And that's why we often tell two tales of love in one. We tell the story of true love involving individuals swept away, love at first sight. But we also tell the story of how the community reacts to that love at first sight, and often reacts in a spirit of absolutely phobic, violent, and hateful suppression of the love. That's why for every Romeo and Juliet, there has to be also a Paris who is produced by the Capulet family as an appropriate love object for Juliet, because Capulet comes from the same clan or an acceptable communal background, which Romeo does not.
Okay. So on that note, Gil, do you think that now we've also been talking about how a woman's agency is often denied. So I'd like to ask you that even with this law, there's been a lot of dispute around how it denies a woman her agency. So how do you think that Juliet would react to a law like this?
Well, Shakespeare's Juliet is such an interesting character because she so owns her own desire, perhaps even more than Romeo to a certain extent. And she, of course, is also much more at the receiving end of her parents' attempt to control her love. We see Romeo's parents, and of course they're dismayed about his choices in love, but in Romeo and Juliet, as in India in 2020, the enormous burden of social responsibility, of respecting tradition, of respecting the honor and purity of the family falls on the woman. I think Juliet would be disgusted by these laws.
So I also wanted to ask you how we often imagine the love jihad to be a Muslim man marrying a Hindu woman, but we never imagine it the other way around. So would you have something to share about that?
Well, if we look at Bollywood films, over and over again, what we see when we see intercommunal relations, relations between a Hindu man and a Muslim woman, it's almost as if that's acceptable because, of course, there's a patriarchal grid at work here, that if a Hindu man marries a Muslim woman, then the Muslim woman is going to be subordinate to the Hindu, which is acceptable. Hinduism isn't threatened. If anything, its cojones, its masculine entitlement is underlined when a Hindu man takes a Muslim girl as a wife. We almost never see a Muslim man with a Hindu woman in Bollywood cinema. There are one or two exceptions, but they're extraordinarily rare. And the idea that a Muslim man could be with a Hindu woman is too close to what the lawmakers in states like Uttar Pradesh or Haryana or Madhya Pradesh most fear. When they say they fear love jihad, what they're really fearing is the idea that a Hindu woman could act on her own desires and choose a non-Hindu man, and that in the process, the entire community would not only be shamed, but somehow emasculated because the sexual prowess as well as the social power of a non-Hindu man would be affirmed by a union between a Hindu woman and a Muslim man, for instance.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. Manjeet is asking, in order to qualify as love jihad, does the intention of such a union count for something which would separate love stories from conversation stories? I think she means conversion stories.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we've got to be careful about how we phrase such questions, because intention is something that is so often ventriloquized by the state, by parents. And we've seen plenty of cases, for instance, the Hadia case in Kerala, where two adults entered into a consensual relationship. The problem is that one was formerly a Hindu woman who converted to Islam and who had chosen to convert to Islam, but her parents were convinced that she couldn't have intended to do this. And this is how the entire case unfolded. Now, I think we tend to play very fast and loose with the category of intention. We say it should be all about the intention of the lovers. But if the lovers intend something that society does not socially sanction, then we say they can't have really intended it. She didn't really know what she was doing. Her parents know better, and her parents' intentions therefore become more important. So we've got to be very careful how we use intention and to what extent we end up either projecting our own wishes onto the desires of a consensually adult couple, and to what extent we start ventriloquizing the desires of convention, society, etc.
Yeah, that's a very interesting statement when you say that we start ventriloquizing the desires of the society on the desires of two individuals involved. So do you now also think that, since you repeatedly said that Shakespeare could have been a Bollywood writer, but do you think that contemporary politics has anything to do with how the Khan industry, particularly in Bollywood, is on decline? And we've also never heard from our stars who are Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, or a statement on Love Jihad. So do you think that there's a certain relationship between the cinema and the politics that we're seeing in our country?
Well, of course. And I think the powers that be know that Bollywood is one of the most influential forms of soft power culturally. And that's why we've been seeing the pinch placed so tightly on Bollywood in recent years. The types of film that are being made are changing a great deal. Of course, it would be great if an Amir Khan or a Shah Rukh Khan or a Salman Khan were to speak out against the Love Jihad ordinances. But I think we've also got to feel for them. Yes, they have a certain amount of social and cultural capital that they can spend, and in an ideal world, you would hope they would spend it to take a stand. But they're also, at the end of the day, in very tricky positions. We've seen what's happened when Amir Khan has taken a fairly, I think, non-controversial stand and said that he fears for his son growing up in the India of today. We saw how he lost most of his sponsorship, or not most, but significant sponsorship deals. We've seen backlashes against Shah Rukh Khan as well for statements he said here and there. And the vehemence that Muslims in the public sphere have to be subjected to, I think we can't rule that out. And demanding that they say what we want them to say without realizing their vulnerability, no matter how powerful they are in the industry, is a bit short-sighted.
All right. So now that you're talking about the kind of backlash that the Khans have received, do you think that we have sort of moved, and this sort of backlash probably wouldn't have been seen in the past? Do you think we've moved away from a society that used to take pride in mixtures to a society that's getting more and more polarized? And if yes, then how would a Shakespeare respond to such a society? How would a Shakespeare reimagine India?
So it's my answer is complex because I don't think there ever was a day where once upon a time we were all happy with mixture, where we're all bhai bhai and ben ben. There have always been tensions. And I think, of course, the long shadow of caste in the subcontinent means that there have been hang-ups particular to India about ideas of purity and fears of mixture. That said, I think we've witnessed a distinct change over the last few years. And I think there has been a systematic forgetting of histories of syncretism, pluralism, mixture that are a vital, vital part of the subcontinent's history, including its recent history. And I would draw your viewers' attention to a wonderful piece that appeared in the Indian Express today about the activist Faisal Khan, who is currently in jail, facing a very cruel detention. What's his story? Faisal Khan has put together an organization that tries to promote harmony between Muslims and Hindus. And his model was a group of freedom fighters from the northwestern frontier in the 1930s and 1940s, Hindus and Muslims who joined forces against the British. Faisal Khan has gone around the country with other Muslim and Hindu activists promoting concord. And one of the things he has done is gone to mandirs and recited what is it called? The Ramchitra Manas, but recited it wearing a skull cap as an illustration of communal concord, that a Muslim can be fully immersed in Hinduism. Now, a photo of him wearing a skull cap in a mandir went viral. Right-wing Hindutva groups protested, and he was promptly arrested, and he's been detained ever since. What's his crime? For attacking communal harmony. Because nowadays, what defines communal harmony is not the possibility of Muslims and Hindus praying together, understanding each other, speaking the same language, mixing. What defines communal harmony is the uncontested superiority and purity of the majority religion. So I think we've seen a significant shift, and that's something I'd like to believe Shakespeare would have been, if not horrified by, absolutely puzzled by. And that plays like Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra, Troilus and Cressida, a poem like Venus and Adonis, all of them are trying to enlarge the horizon of imaginative possibility by presenting to us couples who, despite social restrictions, come together and whose love we're meant to cherish, not repudiate.
Thank you for your answer, Gil. That's a very nice note to end this conversation on. We must have lovers who love each other across religion and have a love that we can cherish. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience for their questions and tuning in.